As an aquaculture business owner, how do you tackle the balance in being profitable and sustainable at the same time? That's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. Welcome to episode 3 of the Business of Aquaculture. In this episode, we have Mr. Bill Collins of Cascadia Seaweed. Bill's career spans almost 40 years and evolved from success in international science to success in business on the world stage. Bill was trained as a geologist and received a Master of Science degree from Memorial University. Since moving to the Victoria area in 1994, Bill has been responsible for bringing a locally invented sonar system to the world stage, including sales to more than 20 navies and government institutions. As part of the ownership group of an award-winning high-tech company, Bill has filled many corporate roles, including merger and acquisition activities. Bill has a passion for creating and executing sound business plans and a strong belief in Vancouver Island business growth opportunity. So listen in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the show, Bill. Thanks for being here.
You're more than welcome, Lourdes. It's great to be here.
I'm glad that you were able to grace us sometimes. I know that, as you mentioned a while ago, entrepreneurs don't have a holiday. It's Easter today, and you're here with me. So thank you.
Excellent.
So let's get this ball started. And so my first question is, how did you get into the aquaculture industry, specifically in the business of seaweed aquaculture?
I took a contract from the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, and the idea was to identify business opportunities specific to Vancouver Island, but to coastal British Columbia in general, where the business would have a global competitive advantage. So we started off with about 50 options and narrowed it down to 4 as part of that report. One was clean tech because of the critical mass of engineers that are available. One was cultural tourism because we were leveraging, and this was pre-COVID obviously, we were leveraging the opportunity for coastal peoples to tell their story and to gain economic development by attracting tourism from Europe in particular. The other one was in value-added forestry products. There's a ton of wood gets cut in British Columbia every year in Vancouver Island. Did you know that about 30% of the wood that gets cut down on Vancouver Island actually remains on the forest floor?
Wow.
So this was a travesty in our view. And so we searched for value-added opportunities where these what would typically be considered waste wood were actually utilized. And then, of course, the fourth area, which brings us closer to aquaculture, was certainly on our list. When I look at the GDP that aquaculture contributes to British Columbia, it's a big number. And that's manifest through employment, business development, and economic development opportunities for coastal communities. So it is very important. However, one of the big drivers behind becoming global and delivering a global competitive advantage is attracting, if you can, foreign direct investment. So if I'm a South Korean entrepreneur and I'm looking to invest in business on Vancouver Island, and if the business was aquaculture, I would Google Vancouver Island aquaculture. And what I would more than likely end up with was some discussion about open net pen salmon farming versus not, and sustainability. And you would say, okay, I'm not going to invest any money in this business. There's too much controversy. However, when you peel back the layers of the onion and you see that aquaculture is a three-legged stool, one of which is finfish aquaculture, one is shellfish aquaculture, and the new kid on the block, seaweed aquaculture. And if you were to try and focus specifically on seaweed aquaculture, there represents a tremendous undelivered opportunity to add strength to that stool. And so we opted to suggest to the population and through this report that, you know what, you should consider putting aside the challenges that aquaculture have in sustainability and look at the economic development opportunity and ask yourself the question, if we do this right in harmony with the planet, can it make money, and can we have a global industry based here in Vancouver Island? The answer is most definitely yes. So that's why we decided to take it on. More importantly, the opportunity was so great, I just couldn't leave it to somebody else to do. So very quickly, a team was assembled with some really knowledgeable folks, And that team is what's delivered Cascadia Seaweed.
That's amazing. I was just telling some of the people I've been interviewing, it's so good to be able to do this firsthand because I don't know the story behind how people got into the industry. So thank you for sharing that. And you already mentioned it's one of the most promising industry that's coming online is green tech. You mentioned clean tech. I know there's the materialization and finance that's happening as well, including med tech and some of the things that's happened in the education industry. So we're basically at the precipice of some interesting progress happening in the business, especially after COVID. So my second question then is, um, what are the pros and cons that you can see in the industry? I know you mentioned already something along the lines of the controversies around aquaculture, but maybe you can name us some more.
So, number one, in our view, is an alignment of the regulatory approval process with the economic opportunity. And this is one of our biggest challenges. Governments have a very important role to play in making sure that any commercialization of any natural resource is done to the benefit of the population of Canada, which we all know now includes and doing things in harmony with the environment. An ocean environment is a particularly challenging area because we know way more about terrestrial commercialization than we know about the impacts of commercialization in the coastal zone and in water. So it adds another dimension to that understanding adds another dimension to the challenge of ensuring that we're doing this and executing this business correctly. So that's obviously what the government's role is. From our perspective, one thing we are quite categorical in saying is that government demands industry innovate, and we all know it's good in support of productivity goals of Canadians in general. We're now suggesting that government has to innovate in the way they're tracking the regulatory framework, specifically around seaweed. And that's our biggest challenge is we have a growth opportunity. We can finance it. There's a lot of folks very willing to write checks to industry that finds itself at the intersection of climate action, food security, and coastal economic development in general, and specifically an opportunity for economic development in First Nations. So there's a tremendous number of impact investors that see seaweed cultivation as really important in all of these three factors. What's really going to be challenging is to allow farms to go in the water at a scale up that will meet the demands in the marketplace. And this is the biggest challenge that we have.
Is there some promises in terms of how it can be addressed sooner? I know I'm saying this based on experience. One of our tenure took actually more than 10 years before it got approved. Is there some progress along that arena that seems to be hopeful in terms of what changes are going to happen?
Yeah, they're definitely by Cascadia coming on board and raising the awareness, there is definitely a willingness at the multiple levels of government to support the growth of the industry. There's no question about that. However, willingness doesn't necessarily translate into action and regulatory change. We believe that clearly we're out front because we're attracting the investment and we're making the applications to put infrastructure in the water. We're at a funny time because of the multiple government agencies that are required to manage these applications. The public is demanding more accountability, which you would think would translate into higher levels of scrutiny and perhaps even higher levels of regulation. So we're seeing governments, for example, the federal government pushing more for a better understanding of what's going on and its impacts. Obviously, it's being demanded because do no harm and the precautionary approach, which is embedded in DFO, for example, is very important for the people of Canada. So we do see and expect a higher level of scrutiny. At the same time, the federal government, through commitments such as UNDRIP, are required to heavily consult, which is the right and prudent thing to do when we're working in multiple government jurisdictions, including government-to-government with First Nation to our federal government or our provincial government for that matter. So there's a higher level of scrutiny required to make sure the process is being managed correctly and that everybody has a say in the development. So you have the federal government DFO, Transport Canada, for example, is now asking for higher levels of consultation. And Transport, by the way, are also now asking where we think there's overlap between DFO. For example, infrastructure is going in the water. Safety of navigation is the traditional place that the Transport has been. Now they're asking questions about cetacean entanglements, for example. So there seems to be a lot of overlap. And where that all will land it leaves a big question mark for companies such as ourselves that follow the science. The science says there's more benefit from seaweed cultivation than there is negative impact. The opportunity for carbon is in the future is high for carbon sequestration. As we decarbonize the atmosphere and recarbonize the biosphere, seaweed cultivation does provide a significant opportunity in the future to do this. We know with climate change, we're losing seaweed biomass. As seaweed cultivators, our goal is to improve the biomass without negatively impacting biodiversity. We believe we're improving biodiversity because we have very strict protocols in where we can introduce different genetics. And that's, we have the beautiful advantage here in British Columbia, having access to 630 species means there's been a tremendous history of biodiversity in seaweed. And through climate change, that is becoming less and less so. And we believe through seaweed cultivation, we can start to put back the clock a little bit in this biodiversity, not to mention other ecosystem services that kelp cultivation has in improving water quality, reducing ocean acidification, for example, and providing habitat. The other thing I'll mention is that the science has to be shown, but we believe strongly that improvement of kelp in its natural environment will improve the outcome for salmonoids as they're moving out and growing. So for many, many reasons, scientifically based, we believe seaweed cultivation is good for the planet and good for coastal BC. This has to be matched with the opportunity that government sees for economic development against the regulatory framework. And this is where we're asking for all parties to innovate because one thing is clear, the clock is ticking and we can't wait to change the planet.
Very well said. Very well said. I love the way that you mentioned about biodiversity, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit. How does that support in terms of integrated multitrophic?
Yeah, so this was some work done, pioneered somewhat on Vancouver Island, probably a decade ago, where the idea is to apply aquaculture, species variation in a more holistic approach, maybe something that mimics more of a circular ecosystem. The theory being that if you have finfish and both effluent and nutrients and other things that are flowing out of an open net pen, if downstream of those you could grow shellfish aquaculture, because the shellfish can utilize some of the excess that may come from a finfish farm, of which you're getting less and less excess materials, but you would see an advantage for growing shellfish by growing it next to finfish aquaculture operations. And then if you go further down in the food chain, then the next one would be macroalgae, or microalgae for that matter. But macroalgae, seaweed, kelp, specifically, if you grew that downstream of shellfish farms, then both the seaweed and the shellfish would be better off because of that symbiosis and synergy between those two species growing close together. So the science behind multitrophic aquaculture suggests that to be beneficial. We know, for example, anecdotally, the seaweed that we're growing next to shellfish operations seems to be doing better in close proximity. I also know anecdotally from speaking to folks at the World Wildlife Fund who are champion seaweed aquaculture globally, they say that you end up with a higher meat mass, perhaps because there's more food available. As the seaweed grows, it sloughs off, bits fall off, which may become food for mussels or oysters, for example. And secondly, we also understand that in seaweed, extracts a lot of calcium out of seawater. In fact, there's 10 times more calcium in seaweed than there is in milk. So we asked the question, well, maybe if there's a higher proportion of calcium in the water, or available calcium because seaweed is extracting it, maybe that means you're going to have a better shell structure in a mussel or oyster. Those are the kinds of questions that multitrophic analysis science looks to solve, looks to answer. We at Cascadia, we believe in that IMTA science. We can't quantify it and haven't quantified it yet. We hope it will come to pass, that it's an important thought. And, this is why we have operations. We have farming operations, for example, in the Klahoose territory near Cortes Island, off Vancouver Island, where we are growing seaweed next to mussel farms. And over the next couple of years, we'll ensure that we look at, well, obviously our yield is important, but we'll also work closely with the Klahoose in the yield that comes from the mussel farming operations, and ultimately will give us a better idea of how true the statement would be that they both, kelp and mussels, end up in a better position.
Thank you. And my last question to you is, what are the top 3 trends that you're seeing in the industry?
I will say the food business, what we're seeing in general is a conversion to plant-based food. So on the bigger picture for Cascadia Seaweed, because we're plant-like, we're an algae, we're not a plant, but we're plant-like. So that's important for us, that trend. And there's been a lot of investment in things like Beyond Meat and Impossible and those kinds of things. So that really helps us. In terms of the aquaculture business, we see technology trends will continue to grow, not only to support claims that the future of aquaculture will be one of using technology to reduce or mitigate any negative environmental effects that are brought to bear. So technology can really help drive, and technology should also be able to help improve margins. So there will likely be more technology, and to be honest, I don't know too much about the finfish aquaculture business, but in talking to folks, I know there's been a tremendous investment by this industry in supporting technological improvements to mitigate any negative impacts. Just how far they've gone and how far that will be acceptable to the general public and governments who are trying to regulate all of this, I can't say. What we do is we say the more seaweed you grow, the better it is for the planet. And it's one of the few industries where the more you do it, the better it is for the planet. And so it's that sustainability. In fact, at Cascadia, we no longer want to be just sustainable. We want to be climate positive. We want to be the model for industries that can come to the fore and demonstrate it through our actions that we are better for the planet. And the more we do it, the better it is. That's our starting point. As we grow, we'd like to continue to contribute to the body of science that proves this, at the same time as continue to deliver economic development opportunities for coastal BC, and in particular our First Nations partners, which are on our critical path to success. They're a full, true partner in what we're trying to do, and we'd like to see that continue and grow and prosper.
Thank you very much, Bill. So maybe you can give our audience how they can get in touch with you and you can promote. I know that the Seaweed Festival days are coming.
Yes, they can reach out at info@cascadia.ca or seaweeddays.com if you want to know more about the Seaweed Festival. And our doors are always open, particularly to talk about impacts on climate and climate action. This is at the core of what we do. So we're always willing, able, and ready to talk about those things.
Thank you again, Bill. My biggest takeaway from this episode is I love what you said about a seaweed not being a plant, but it's plant-like and it's rich in calcium. I'm lactose intolerant. And so I love knowing that information, but also the way that you've spin in terms of the word sustainability, which is slowly getting into the generation in terms of what the connotation is, but spin that into being climate positive. So Thank you once again and really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening, and I hope you are inspired from this episode. Do take a moment and share this with your friends and colleagues, and rate and review the podcast wherever you go get it. Our next episode, I will be interviewing Mr. Jim Gibbons of Shuttle Shellfish, which is one of the pioneers in the Guidak aquaculture industry in Washington State. He will talk to us about the success of his company in attracting investors who became his shareholders, plus inviting ideal partnerships that makes his business sustainable. Thanks again, Bill.
Hey, see you, Lourdes.